Christopher Aversano. Welcome to the Further and Further podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be on the other side of the mic. I think it's been a little while since I've actually done somebody else's, so excited to be here.
I would like to start today with superpowers.
Okay.
One of yours is connecting people in the maritime industry. And in thinking through this, I bet that bringing the right people together is something you were doing naturally even before you ever put a maritime frame around it. Do you remember when you first noticed that you had a talent for this and knew you wanted to do more of it?
That's a great question. I don't know if I ever really noticed it beforehand. Saying that, I've been in the maritime space for over 30 years. So I really don't know if I've ever had that experience outside, because it would have been in, let's say, during my informative years. I think really more along the lines of, I just thought there was places and things beyond your own little space where I grew up in New York. Now, you could say it's called upstate New York. It's not really upstate New York. Upstate New York is a very controversial topic because it depends on where you're from. If you're from New York City, upstate New York is anything over Westchester County. And if you're from, let's say, near Albany or Utica, that is upstate New York. So I'm somewhere in the middle, but I always thought that there was something beyond kind of what where I was raised. I was actually born and raised in New York City. Then we moved to kind of that part of New York. So I don't think it was necessarily a realization of connecting. I just knew there was more things out there. And then as I got into the industry, I realized that networking is super important. I went to SUNY Maritime College, and Admiral Floyd Miller used to say, you are all lucky to be here because you have one of the largest networks in the world, that you will find graduates of this school. And then I always preface it, or will say, but from other schools of similar all over the world in all sorts of different industries. And I think that that's really, I would say that was more the defining moment. It wasn't necessarily outside of maritime, but it was certainly when I started my journey, that you have this great network. And he was referring to the Alumni Association, but I think it can be built into other areas. You have this great network that's right there. And I think that LinkedIn has really put the highlighter pen on that really you should be able to build a network or have access to building a network relatively quickly and relatively painlessly with LinkedIn and other tools as well. But I think LinkedIn from a professional point of view is definitely one to look out.
You raised a good point about access. When you first started out, I mean, and even now, when you go to an event, you realize there's a room full of people and everyone could be interesting to meet for one reason or another. But some people kind of treat it like speed dating. They run around, have like 2-second conversations and then just kind of move on. I've never been one of those. And I sense you're not either. For people starting out, how would you advise them to think about networking?
It's a two-pronged approach, right? Like understanding what people's different roles and career paths are is definitely something that LinkedIn can help, right? And if you're a college student or somebody who's, let's say, I'm talking very specifically to the maritime space, getting off the ships and like, all right, well, what's next? Look at other people's track. Did they sail? Did they go to the same university? So on and so forth. And understanding their background and what they do. And that's always an important part of kind of understanding, all right, well, maybe I want to network with them because I have a similar career path. It looks like they're doing something pretty cool that I would want to do. And I think that is one of the important parts. And I think even just adding connections on LinkedIn and so on. But I think that you take that and you do live events, and whether it's just a meeting drink someplace, whether it's an event that you can go to maybe for free or no low cost, what I would suggest is definitely for people who are networking, if you have a target, if you see people who you know are going to be there, recognize their name, you could have a target list and try to focus in on them and see what they're, approach them and talk to them, or even through LinkedIn say, hey, I noticed you're going to be at London International Shipping Week. I'm going to be around at some of those events. Love to meet up. Most people say yes. Even if you're kind of newer to the maritime space, most people will say yes, or if they say no, it's because they're busy. But most people would want to take a few minutes. And I think just if you don't have the time to prep, or maybe the prep doesn't go as well, of course, just going to those events and saying, hey, well, what do you do? What's your role? And just meet and chat with people. Most of the time, those folks, you know, uh, who go to events, want to meet and talk to folks. And yeah, sometimes they have a goal of, well, I need to, create so much pipeline, or I need to talk to this client or so on. But a lot of times there's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of opportunity there. I'll tell you a great story. I was at an event and I was talking to somebody, this younger guy, waiting to me to finish up. And I honestly thought he wanted to talk to the other person who was a little bit more important than me. And he turns around and says, "Oh, no, I'm waiting for you. You're the dinosaur guy. Like, I wanted to talk to you and talk about your podcast." And I was like, "Oh, wow, that was kind of interesting." But don't hesitate to do that sort of thing, because that's super important. I don't mind a LinkedIn DM. That's probably the easiest way. I try to respond to all of them. Sometimes I'm a little late, but I do try to respond. I have no problem meeting somebody for a coffee at a pub, at an event. Hey, I'll be wearing a blue suit, me and everybody else, but look for me there and try to hunt me down, because a lot of events you'll have a name tag. Some folks ignore you, but then again, you have to worry about what value you're going to get if they end up doing that route. But yeah, I think a LinkedIn direct message is probably the best place to start.
One of the most decorated examples of your superpower in action, your podcast, The Last Dinosaur. I want to talk through a little bit of the behind the scenes today, where the impetus came to create this maritime podcast specifically focused on shipping in the digital age, and how you got started.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing on that, has a couple of layers, right? One is I kind of always had that idea. I think I came up with the name at one point. I'm like, oh, that's a great name for a podcast, and like, I got to figure it in. But really, I had the idea for a long time about doing a podcast in maritime. And if you look at it, I kind of keep track of it. I publish something once every 6 months. And there's about 50 to 60 podcasts that are maritime, a little less if you strip out some of the ones that overlap into supply chain, probably closer to 50 or so. And, part of the impetus was having some thought leadership within the space around the digitalization. Because what I found is there's a lot of great podcasts out there that talk more general maritime goings on. And what I wanted to focus on was something really specific, was a digital transformation. There's a lot of discussion about it, but it's in fits and spurts in different areas. And it's not to knock those other ones, but some of the other podcasts have a more general approach, which is okay. I think anything to highlight some of the good, or at least some of the transformative things that are happening in our space, is really important, because we are definitely a forgotten industry. People don't realize we're there. And I think we have that problem. And I think that part of all the podcasts, yours included, will definitely help shed a light that, hey, we are definitely, we are a real part of what's going on in the industry, not only in the industry, but in the world. So it was part of it. But really, I wanted to focus on that and then become a thought leader in that space, which I was able to do. But then it's also, like I said, the contribution to getting the word about what the folks do in the maritime space for the global economy, not only for national economies, but for people and how they make a living and how they do all these different things, whether it's shoreside or out at sea. I think it was really important. And that's part of the impetus there. I think it kind of came to a head towards the end. I was the president of the Connecticut Maritime Association for 2 years during COVID. I was wrapping up my presidency in April of 2022, and kind of ahead of that, I really enjoyed kind of some of the speaking, some of the thought leadership, and I wanted to parlay some of the work that I did with CMA into my own thing. And that was also part of the timing, is that as my presidency of CMA ran down, I was able to ramp this up. And that's kind of it in a nutshell. So really, it was thought leadership. It was getting the positive word out for maritime, and the timing was just right.
I really like what you say about the positive word, because in these networking opportunities and conferences, you meet some incredible people with stories. I'm frequently humbled and grateful for just these chance interactions. And I think it's only when you sort of take a step back and you realize most people who aren't standing in this room don't have that view in. They don't have this sense of the people that are moving the industry. This is such an important way of being able to allow more of a window in. There's so much to learn from these conversations. How do you choose who you want to speak to? There's no shortage of brilliant and deserving characters, so I'm sure that can't be easy.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for me, it started with, well, firstly, understanding what I want to do with the podcast. And that's one of the reasons why I kind of, it's a niche within a niche, right? So maritime is a very specific topic, but then going into digital maritime, even more specific, it actually worked out. I thought that through, and that's what everybody says to do is you have to think out, what am I doing? What am I trying to achieve with this? And who am I going to interview, or what am I going to talk about if you're doing your own podcast? And at that point, it was pretty easy. I sat down and I wrote down all of the, ideal guests. And I wrote down, basically, there were people that I knew. So friends of Chris, right? And I went down, I said, okay, this one, this one, this one. And my first couple, I went with some people who I thought in my mind wouldn't mind if they were an experiment. So in other words, if I only did 10 episodes, they wouldn't be like, hey, you wasted my time. You only did 10 episodes, right? I had to think that through. And I kind of went through some people I knew, some people I didn't. I knew only through LinkedIn. Again, the power of LinkedIn and the power of social connections like that. And at that time, we were coming out of COVID. I said, okay, let me get these folks. And that's what I did. And then what has happened is, as the podcast has grown, more people have reached out. I get a lot of contact from public relation firms specific to the maritime space saying, hey, I have this client, I have that client. What do you think? And, there are some folks I have to say no to, but generally they're all very good. And then I kind of go through and I say, okay, does what they want to talk about fit into what I want to talk about? And I go back a little bit as you start to develop a list of people. And I have a fairly decent list of people that I can interview. You start to think about, what do I, as the podcast host, want to talk about? And who would be interesting to me? Because then you get into the whole creativity aspect of it. And that just opens up a whole other door. You're doing it for you, not for anybody else. And I think if you keep that in mind, that's definitely one of the things now. I'm positively at a place where, I have the freedom to kind of pick and choose who I want. I do want to have as many voices from the different places as possible. But they also have to align to what I'm trying to get out there and what I think I would find interesting, and by extension, the audience would find interesting.
What if these conversations taught you about yourself and the roles you want to play in the industry that you never could have imagined when you started?
So I think for myself, I think one of the biggest things is just, when I have to write it down, I like to yap. I'm a big yapper, so I have to listen to work on my listening skills, certainly one of my important tools in the toolbox. And, the other thing too is don't be limited in your past performance, your past jobs or whatever, right? I think people get hung up on, where they went to college, what they did. And that was probably one of the important things for me on developing this podcast was it's mine. Like, this is mine. Like, nobody owns this. Maybe I'll get along the way, get a little bit of advertising or stuff like that, but it's still mine, right? And I think that's a huge thing, especially if you're not working for yourself. I think people who work for themselves can really appreciate that. And I spent most of my life working for companies. So that was something that really, I learned the value of working and creating something that is 100% mine. Nobody else in it. This is not a company property. This is mine. And, I get to dictate the tone, the tenor. I don't change any words to make it sound something different. But I'm just talking about the questions and how I want to present it. And I get to play around with marketing and different Canva styles and video and, really get to see what works and what frankly, a lot of times what doesn't work in terms of publishing the podcast and stuff. So I think that's the biggest thing that I learned is really, I don't come from an entrepreneurial background. This kind of sticks my toes in that a little bit still while I have the safety net of working full time. So I think that's probably the most interesting dynamic that I learned about myself.
In creating your own channel, and anyone who's thinking about creating their own channel, expressing their voice on their own terms. What role do you think this plays as far as how they can evolve what they're offering in the industry?
One of my biggest things I think about is that as you do this independently and you work for a company like myself or other companies, what I think companies are realizing is there is a huge value for them because, you're this authentic voice. I don't sell anything on my podcast from my company. I occasionally talk about it. I occasionally talk about my experiences with the companies I work with, but not necessarily the underlying tools from a sales point of view. And I think that companies kind of like that because marketing is always looking for that authentic voice, right? Not this canned kind of persona, but an authentic voice. And I think that that's one of the most important things. It actually makes you more of an asset for a company. I think that that's, and keeps your stickiness, especially if companies think about downsizing. Maybe as some people view as a liability, you have this platform and blah, blah, blah. But I think there's a lot of people a lot of companies are starting to come to that realization that they want their employees to have this kind of creative social media presence.
I think this touches on an important point because we all talk about how your reputation and your relationships, how well you've built your network is the catalyst for whether something happens or not and how quickly. And yet there's still an over reliance on certain credentials being treated as the only markers of credibility over, thriving networks and crossover skills, which many cases can be just as, if not more valuable. So how do you think we can bring about a shift in mindset around credibility so that we can call in more creativity, neurodiversity, and agility for the new roles that the industry needs?
Yeah, I think right now it still is, what's your pedigree, what's where you come from. I think that's always will always be there. But I always think it's also who you know, right? And I think as you increase that network, you know more people. I think that's what it comes down to. You got to get yourself out there. You got to know more people. The more people that know you, the more people they're going to be willing to give you a chance. And I think it reduces that line of we have to, hire only somebody with a certain pedigree who has spent time at a certain company, because not all the time it works. I can point to certain things that happened and where, where a company that I saw a lot of great pedigree with a lot of right universities, a lot of the right, backgrounds, and the company ended up sort of folding onto itself. A lot of it, they didn't have that diversity within the industry they were trying to serve. In other words, the maritime space. And I think that that's a lesson learned for people to go, hey, we need to make sure that we hire a diverse workforce, that we have people who, yeah, okay, maybe they didn't go to an Ivy League school here in the US, but they get what we're trying to do. And that's going to be important. And then, all the other intangibles, interest, enthusiasm, stick-to-itiveness, networks, all play into success in a role and success in a company, I think.
Are you seeing this shifting as fast as you think that it needs to, given, important this is going to be as digitalization continues?
I think it is happening. It's really hard for me to tell because I do see, people getting hired and moving roles and stuff like that. So it does seem to be pretty positive. Then again, my LinkedIn could have a bias of people who are in my connection. So you're going to hear more about it. So I feel that is happening. I think that certainly if you look at a positive from COVID, it was that people are more comfortable with remoting together and, remote working. And I think that that's super important because I think that's going to allow companies to go outside the regional confines and hire people, the right people. And I think the right people may be somebody that from a network point of view, but maybe they don't have work for the right company or things like that. So I think it's happening. It's really hard for me to tell, but I feel that it is, and I feel that part of that is driven by more and more companies investing into the maritime space for startups, whether it's Motion Venture in Singapore, the Dock in Israel, TMV here in New York, the flagship founders in Germany, and I can go on and on and on. But there's, a handful of really big ones, those mentioned, probably a couple others, apologize if I missed some, that are they'll hire maritime people, non-maritime people, anybody who has a similar, we need people with AI skill sets, and we'll, hire a maritime person to help you train the model, right? So I think that from that point of view, it seems like it's working. Again, boots on the ground, which I don't have. It's a little harder to give you a real reading, but it does feel like things are moving for sure.
What do you think it is about podcasts that makes them a priority? Something that people make time to listen to in spite of all the other things competing for their attention.
One of the things that somebody who appreciates my podcast, Dr. Jason Zeidemann, senior person, runs the North American Maritime Maritime Ministries, and he said, Chris, I listened to a podcast at like 1.5 or 1.8x speed.
Really?
Yeah. And I was like, what is wrong with you, man? Now, here's a man of faith who helps our seafarers on a day in, day out basis. Great organization that really supports the seafarers here in North America. He's very active. And Jason told me, he goes, I love your podcast, but I listened to it like when I first met him, when he first told me that, it was like 1.5, but I think he was up to like 2. And I tried to listen to something at 2, and I'm like, holy smokes, my brain does not work that fast. And he said, when I talk to people in real life, I have to get used to them, how slow they talk. So I think that story aside, I do think that it's super important that people can get through a long format in significantly longer. My podcasts are 30 to 40 minutes long. I try not to go much longer than that. And so somebody, 1.5x, it's less than a half an hour, right? So 25 minutes on their way to work, walking the dog, or doing kind of, let's say, more routine work, filling out their travel expenses. You pop in a podcast on YouTube or whatever, and you just listen to it, and you could absorb what you want. And I think people like to have that loose discussion rather than formatted data. It helps them form an opinion. And if they want to know more, they could go out and go, what was Emma referring to? And, oh, okay, she put a link, and I'll read that. But for the most part, it allows them, especially again, post-COVID, allows them to be part of a conversation without leaving their desk or, taking off their earbuds.
I think there's also this intimacy to it. You can understand a lot by the dynamic between the people and what is said and what is not said, and the humor. And I think, and it doesn't have to be extremely long in order to get to that point. Some people can arrive there right away. You do that very well. And I also really appreciate that about Undocked. Immediately, it's just like listening in on some friends, getting to be a bystander and sort of take that in. And I think that is really welcome, because I've noticed that these days people really ask a lot fewer questions than they used to. And it's quite enjoyable for someone to be able to be on the other side of curiosity. Just get to kind of lean into that.
Yeah, I think people definitely like to chat and to be asked questions. I think asking questions is definitely becoming a lost art. I'm sure there's articles around for everywhere about that. But I think the other part is, I had somebody describe my podcast early on as informal but informative, right? And I think that that's the sweet spot, right? You want to make sure that you're informing your audience, right? Whether it's about digitalization, whether it's about a career path, whether it's kind of just about more, like you mentioned, Undocked with Nick and Raul, and how they kind of, looking at the market. Well, that's just giving an interesting market perspective. And, they're kind of doing some of the homework for you, right? Like of talking about some mergers or talking about an acquisition or talking about, I think, even some events. And so it's helping, with the education there. And I think that that's, informing people on a regular basis should be the goal of the podcast, or I guess entertaining as well. There is a lot of podcasts I listen to for entertaining, but certainly from the, informal and informative side is super important.
What podcast do you listen to, both to be informed but also for entertainment?
Yeah, I listen to a couple of the maritime ones. I listen to Lena's. I listen to Raul and Nick's. I've listened to the one or two you've had. I listened to Alison Cusack on hers. She actually did one about tariffs and de-minimis tariff, which I need to listen to because I don't know what that is. So I listened to that. On a not shipping format, I have a wide variety of what I listen to. And again, it just kind of sits on the background. I work from home. I listen to something called The Two Robbies, which is about English Premier League. The two Robbies that are featured here in the U.S. on USA, they talk about like English soccer. So it's kind of interesting. I've followed that. I listened to something called, believe it or not, Sightings, which is about like paranormal stuff. And the way they do it is pretty cool. So they talk about like UFOs, ghosts, stuff like that. I listened to a couple of Star Wars ones because I'm a Star Wars nerd. And yeah, I got a couple others in here. One of the best ones, it was a serial one that they haven't done anything in a million years. It's one of the funniest podcasts I've ever listened to. It's called Dark Air with Terry Carnation. Okay.
That's a great name.
It's
All of those words together, I really
yeah,
like.
it's Rainn Wilson. So if you're familiar with The Office here in the US, it's one of the protagonists. And he plays a radio host that has a nervous breakdown, and he comes back to come on the air, and it's hysterical. It's one of there's one episode that I just listen to whenever I need to laugh. It's the third episode in. It kind of makes fun of certain type of journalism here in the U.S. It's one of the funniest things I've ever listened to in my entire life. So it's called Dark Air with Terry Carnation, and it's Rainn Wilson, and it's hysterical. So I don't want to forget my shout out to my friend Teddy P. Meet the Industry with Teddy P is a good one too. And there was another interesting one called Modes of Thought in Interior Literature, which was kind of a sci-fi one, which I really enjoyed as well. So that kind of still going, but they haven't produced an episode. So there's a few I try to listen to, and I'll get tips and tricks on like kind of how they do intros and outros and how they talk to guests, and some of the ones that are more for entertaining. I listen to like the audio production of music and stuff like that.
One very cool mark of the Last Dinosaur's growth and momentum is the recent distribution deal you signed with Digital Ship. So congratulations on that. I want to ask you how that came about, and if this is something collaboration wise is part of where you envision the podcast future.
So it came out so that's Nick Chubb and his partner, Dave, I think. They were able to purchase the rights of Digital Ship. And as he was kind of in the final end of it, was probably after, he said, "Hey, listen, this is what we've did. We've bought the rights to Digital Ship. We want to revamp it. We want to make it a maritime platform, for multimedia. We want to have offering to potential clients on having their voice advertised on multimedia platforms, including the website and other digital offerings. And we want to have a podcast section. We want yours to be part of it." Very flattered to be part of that, and I thought it was a really good idea. I always thought that the Last Dinosaur fit in well with what Digital Ship was doing. It was overlapped. It made a lot of sense. They have a very good reach in terms of their audience size and the people who subscribe to their newsletter. And it seemed to be a good venture. And going forward, yeah, I think that more and more companies are realizing that people, like you mentioned, are listening to podcasts, are making it part of their consumption, are making part of their education of the industry. It's a very easy way and free way for people to do it, to get educated about an industry, about a product, about what's happening. So I think companies are realizing that a lot more than, let's say, even 3 to 5 years ago.
I like that you use the word education there. And I was excited to hear about the Digital Ship acquisition and the way of imagining this very connected multimedia platform with different podcasts and creative channels and all of this, because the ways in which we consume content and the way that we learn, process information have been changing rapidly. And so to be able to look toward more conversations where there is this sort of protected space where questions are still asked and people have freedom to spar, and they do it on their own terms. I mean, in a sense of, You don't have somebody who you have to answer to in order to be able to have the kind of conversations that you want to, and neither do I. And, you can imagine that a place where all of these voices convene would give somebody who wants to get a better read on where the ecosystem is and how topics are being explored. It would be such a great benefit to them to, not only be able to read through blogs and articles, but also to listen to different types of podcasts, some that are specialized, some that are broader and wandering, some that are more maybe contentious, and all of that, and then arrive at their understanding of some of the core things that we're all wrestling with, and figure out where they want to stand with regards to their role and the impact they want to make in the industry. A lot of that comes from different approaches to content as a form of education.
Yeah, and I think the other part too is honing in on that theme of education. Part of the reason why I stuck with the digitalization side, and again, I've kind of also opened up to social media and how it could be used for some of the positive impacts about recruiting different people, getting that different voices and all other stuff. But really talking about the digitalization side, the big, I talked earlier about the investment side. Well, a lot of the folks, and not necessarily the folks that I mentioned, who a lot of them have a maritime background, but there's a lot of investors that don't have the maritime background and they need to learn about the industry. And, sometimes they'll get a view of the industry that is skewed in a way that maybe paints too rosy of a picture, right? Or because somebody's trying to get investments, so they, oh yeah, everything's gonna be great. Now, I know people do their due diligence and all this other stuff, but part of my audience target was the potential investors, knowing that the investment thesis is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger for people outside the industry to invest in the industry. And I thought that this would be a very good way for people to look at the podcast and go, yep, okay, Chris has a steady stream of people building new technology, of people who have technology that's been around for a while. Let me hear what, the founder, I had John Vesson on, Vesson Nautical, one of the oldest maritime platforms, one of the highest rated ones, because now, he was doing a lot of new stuff and they're buying companies, and I was part of that, one of his acquisitions. But the point there is here's somebody who doesn't speak a lot out at conferences, having a forum to just talk about his evolution. Well, if I'm an investor, I want to hear what he has to say, right? Because what kind of gems can I pick up as I start to look to my investment in a new technology, not even overlapping to what John does, but, something completely different. But so, and I think at the same time to have on some folks, I had Fabian from Kaiko Systems on, new platform. He talked about how he built it, things like that, how he worked with flagship founders. So I think every place in between, the guys and the gals who are investing, well, they want to hear that, right? That's important for them because they need to know kind of what the lay of the land is without, let's say, somebody trying to smooth it over. They want to hear what it is. And I think that education, the podcast allows that, at least a little bit more, less formal, less polished, and just kind of a conversation.
Well, yeah, if you think about the fact that, when you make an investment, it's right, it's not just about what's on the pitch deck and all of the rough edges smoothed out, but about understanding how someone's thought processes and how they respond to something that maybe they didn't expect to be asked, and also how they're looking at everything that their product might sit within. Some of the more interesting, conversations are when people are able to take what they're developing and be able to draw lines between that and everything happening around it because of how interconnected it is, how everything's hitched to everything else. And so if you're an investor and you are thinking, I want to get into the space, I know there's stuff happening here, I'm watching all the M&As that are going on, but I want to really know, not project my own assumptions from other areas that I've been involved with here, because they may not have applicability.
Yeah. And I think the ultimate part, in my opinion, is going to be the relationships, because I think that helps some heritage companies stay around a client a little bit longer. And I think it hurts new companies that may actually have a better offering to get in the door. And I think that, that's something that, going back to your original talk about networking, I think having that networking and having people that could do that, you could build the most fabulous product. I had this discussion with somebody and we were talking about, it was kind of a parallel discussion. And he said to me, I have a great product. He goes, my product speak for itself. I said, well, you don't tell anybody about it. This was more of an internal discussion. I said, well,
Yeah.
you got to tell somebody about it. Well, people should know. Oh, okay. Okay. And it was not necessarily it was an internal discussion, not an external discussion. The point being is you have to have that networking skills. And you have to be able to get somebody's ear sympathetically to you to help you, to help get in front of the right people, to help take a chance with your product, especially if you're trying to, you know, overthrow an incumbent. Or I know in one space, I look at the wind propulsion. It seems like there's about a handful of really interesting technologies, all kind of doing the same thing. So then it's who am I going to pick, right? And I think that does come down a little bit to, boy, I really get along with Susie and not with Chris. So I think we're going to go with their offering. At least on the surface, it seems that way to me. Now I'm a neophyte when it comes to wind propulsion, but I see some of that too. I think it's going to come down to a lot to that sort of stuff. All else being equal, if they have class approval and things like that. That's kind of where I'm thinking.
You often use the word translation. How do you then bring that certainty into a way that someone can receive it within the frameworks that they understand, so that they can say, you know what, you're right, or I totally disagree. But whatever position they take, they know why they're taking it. Because they have actually understood where what you're saying comes from, and what you're offering. It's that message that somebody can really connect to.
We had an interesting discussion with Joy Bassoon. He was talking about his platform. And one of the things that he talks about, I think, is one of the clearest ones, I think, is ROI. Hey, look, you do this, we could show ROI. And I think that's probably one of the easiest ones. But I think the other consideration, and this is where it gets really interesting, in addition to relationships, in addition to ROI, is a lot of this, you got to ask the question, how does it impact the seafarers, right? Not just, the accountant that works on it, but the seafarers themselves. And I think that that's a really interesting question, because they're such a large part of what we do on a daily basis.
And especially as we think about the increasing pressures that they're under, with the dark fleets and all of the technologies that are being introduced are kind of coming up against them, and how we can better support them through the implementation of something new.
Exactly.
So what I'd like to close with today is something that you always ask your guests, because as far as I know, no one has had the chance to ask you this on air. This is, of course, what you're reading these days, but I'd like to broaden it to books in general that have had an impact and shaped you in some way.
I am reading currently 2 books. One is a very business-related one called Measure What Matters. Pretty just started it. It talks about OKRs. So very interesting, very typical big corporate stuff. And I think it's good because you could apply it to business, you can apply it to the podcast. So measuring kind of what matter, goals and key results. I always forget what the O stands for, and I'm sure somebody will correct me. And then the other one that I'm reading is a book, and I can't find the name right now, but it's a book written about venture capital and what the different parts are, who the different players are, how the different structures work, in terms of cap table and everything. And I felt it really important to read that book, because we talk so much about investments, venture capital, how it works, but there is it's not just like, oh, here you have a VC fund. Like, what does it mean? What are these different aspects to it? How does the cap table work? How do the founders get paid? How do the investors get paid? What happens when you go from Series A to Series B? What happens to all these different kind of the capital structure and things like that? So I'm reading that book. I don't have the book in front of me, so I can't remember the name. In terms of a book that has really kind of changed my thinking. I think it's called never split the difference. As a matter of fact, I shouldn't even tell you guys that because then you're going to use the techniques against me. It's about negotiation, and I've taken the Dale Carnegie, or is it Dale Carnegie? No, it's one of these other like negotiating classes that you see in the back of the airline magazines. I took it once at ExxonMobil, once with another company. This, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to Exxon. I'm sorry to my other coworkers that said I had to go to that class. That was not as valuable as reading "Never Split the Difference" by Christopher Voss. He is an ex FBI hostage negotiator. He talks about really framing the negotiation in a way that is pretty unique but very common sense. One of the things that I love to talk about is using the F word and not the one you think of. It's fair. And it really sets the tone for any sort of negotiation you may be involved, whether it's salary, whether it's house, whether it's with your kids. I always lose the ones with my wife, but so it really sets the tone for that. And I reread it if I have a big negotiation coming up. I will reread parts of that. And I will always look at that because there are so many little gems. It is a wonderful book to use as a guidepost in your career wherever you are.
I love this book. How he changes the stigma and relationship that we have to the word no.
Yeah.
That was a really important takeaway the first time that I read it.
I've done a lot of reading about mindfulness as well, and that's kind of noting your reaction and then what I've been reading and trying to practice is your reaction and then, okay, if I make that reaction, how does it impact the other people? And I think that that's something that as I go through my own personal journey, I look at, but that comes from other types of resources as well.
Thank you so much for being here today, Chris. It's a lot of fun.
This was great. Thank you. And best of luck to your growing podcast and keep the faith. It takes a while to really grow, but it sounds like a great forum and good luck to you and the podcast and all the other ventures you're on.